Welcome, everyone, from the campus of Notre Dame. It's another gorgeous day. Yet, like yesterday, we're going to hit 78, maybe even 80 degrees. It's sunny out. You can see students all over the campus and many students and their families who recently were admitted to the university. You can see them taking unofficial tours across campus. There's a real sense of spring and a fullness of life covering campus. Just a few quick updates before we get to our very special interview today. Our COVID positivity rate over the last 7 days remains at about 1%. And so we keep monitoring that very closely. And in fact, I'll be among those who will be surveillance tested this afternoon. As you know, students are mandatory surveillance tests every week, and faculty and staff every other week. So that continues to be a part of the status quo here on campus. We are really thrilled that we were able to announce that beginning tomorrow, we have enough Pfizer vaccines to offer vaccinations for every student, undergraduate, graduate, professional, and including many staff and faculty on campus who may not have already had access to the vaccine. That begins tomorrow, which is April 8th, and it goes through April 15th, that the first wave of the vaccine will be administered, and then 3 weeks later, we'll be able to offer the second dose. Father John has put forward an incentive to the student body that if we can get 90% of the student body, and if they were already vaccinated or in process of being vaccinated elsewhere, they just submit this form via registration. But if we can get 90%, he has mentioned that he is going to loosen a number of the restrictions on campus. For example, inter-dorm visits is one. Another would be to take outdoor gatherings from 10 limit to 25. And those gatherings, you would not need to wear a mask. Also, putting back the basketball courts together and other activities where students could get out there. So we've got to hit that 90% mark, and we're really focused on that. And then some of these restrictions will be limited. There's going to be an announcement that's going to come out this afternoon. I won't spoil the announcement, but it's going to be with regard to vaccinations prior to having the student body return in August for the fall semester. So that will be coming out very shortly today. Lastly, we're really proud that we're going to have an in-person graduation. I think we're on the cutting edge, as we have been all year, in welcoming the full student body back together. We are going to, at this stage, afford at least 2 tickets to family members for each graduate, undergrad and graduate students. And there will be 2 outdoor ceremonies. There'll be a diploma ceremony that will happen during the weekend by college. And then there will be a truncated a baccalaureate mass, followed by an abbreviated commencement ceremony for everyone in the Notre Dame football stadium on May 23rd. We don't know of any other top 20 school in the country that is doing an in-person commencement. If they are doing it only for students and not having any family members attend, but most are just doing a virtual commencement. So we're working on the details to make that all come to fruition in a very safe and enjoyable manner. Today, I am thrilled to welcome one of my favorite Notre Dame professors on campus, Ann Tenbrunsel. Ann is the David E. Gallo Professor of Business Ethics in the Mendoza College of Business. She joined the Notre Dame faculty in 1995. She is also the parent of 2 current Notre Dame students and 1 graduate. And her areas of research focus on the psychology of ethical decision making and examining why employees, leaders, and students behave unethically, despite their best intentions. And this is a far more nuanced area than you might think at first blush. I was exposed a few years ago to a major presentation that Ann delivered in Mexico City for a group of our Latin American alumni, as well as government and business leaders from the capital of Mexico. And it was a riveting presentation. And I, like everyone who was in attendance, just came away blown away by her insights and the way that she was able to provoke deeper thinking around ethical decision making. So, Ann, welcome. Thank you for being with us. My first question goes a little bit to your education. You received your bachelor's degree at the University of Michigan, summa cum laude, and then you went on to get your PhD at Northwestern University in the Kellogg School of Management. How were we able to recruit you back in the mid '90s to come and focus your educational efforts at Notre Dame?
It was not a hard sell, I will tell you that, Lou. I had many of my Michigan friends that were quite mad. I did have somebody turn on their heels and say, "You did what?" and walk away from the conversation. But it was so obvious to me how special Notre Dame was that it was not a hard choice to make. So it was, I actually did. I also had a colleague that was getting a PhD with me and graduated a year early. And she had such a great experience here.
So tell us a little bit about your research. First, one of the things I think makes you really special is being able to reach students and audiences in compelling ways is that you worked in business for a number of years before coming back to do your PhD in consulting and business management and so forth. Tell us a little bit about ethical decision making in business. I mean, at first blush, I thought that you just grew up in the culture that you're in. If you're a person of integrity, you can handle ethical decisions, including in the business world well. But it's much more nuanced than that. Through your research, what are some of the discoveries that you have stumbled upon?
So, well, first of all, thank you for the kind words. So one of the things that really interested me from the beginning was, why is it that very good people, so kind of to the heart of your question, why is it that very good people often end up behaving badly? There's an overwhelming, I think, tendency for people to love the bad apple theory, because as long as it's a bad apple, I don't think that would ever be me. That would never be my corporation. And if it does happen, well, then I can just get rid of the bad apple, and the world is going to be okay.
Yeah.
So I didn't think that that was probably true. So I think there's some statistic, maybe 3% of people are psychopaths. They might be the bad apples that you read about, but they aren't the only ones committing these scandals. And really good companies and really good universities find themselves getting involved in scandals that they might be surprised at. So I wanted to understand why that was. And there's a few things that I think are probably surprising. One is we all tend to overinflate ourselves. So we think we are better decision makers. We think we have more good friends. We think we're better drivers, variety of attributes that we all think that we outperform everyone else, which of course statistically can't be possible. But what we also find is that people really think that they're honest. And in fact, think that they're honest so much more than these other attributes. So while we inflate a variety of our skills and our attributes, we really almost hyperinflate our ethicality attributes. And so I wanted to understand kind of in some sense why that was. So that's, to me, I always say to everybody, if you get nothing else, out of a talk, out of my class, out of the book, it should be that you're not as ethical as you think that you are. And then what I've begun to do is understand again why that is. So what happens to you kind of cognitively in your mind? What happens to you when you enter a group? What happens to you when you enter an organization, and how do all of those kind of in some sense combine to potentially lead you to go astray from your values. And really important, you probably don't realize that you are until it's too late.
So that's fascinating. And how did you come upon this area of focus? Did it emerge from your experience in the workplace, and then you said, as I go back for my master's and PhD at Northwestern, this is an issue that I want to study, or did it emerge more from your academic pursuits?
So kind of a combination of both, Lou. So I knew that I wanted to help people in an organization. So we have lots of places that we can all study. We can study kind of the inner workings of the mind. We can study kind of people's experience within an organization. We can also study, like in my department, people study behavior of firms. So I knew I kind of was most interested in the individual level. Um, and but the academic piece came in for my PhD, because my department that I was in, and particularly my advisor, very well known for kind of decision-making research. So you might be familiar with Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize, that kind of work, thinking fast and slow. And that is why do people deviate from optimality? So you're making a decision and you don't always make the best decision and you don't realize why. I was more interested in why do people make a bad decision from a morality perspective. So what are it about? So similar kind of perspective, what is it about the biases, the situation that might lead us to behaving in a way that deviates from our values?
So how do you teach this? Do you use a case study method to teach this? And maybe could you share with everyone an example that you might use to kind of illustrate nuanced ethical decision making?
Sure. So what I try to do is really get individuals thinking, first of all, to that very first point, which is why we're not as ethical as we think that we are. So I first get them to reflect. So one of the first assignments is to write a paper when you've deviated from your values. And that alone can be trying for, I've had people almost in tears. I'm thinking of a particular class with my executives. One student said, I've held this in for 7 years. I can't tell you how good it is to kind of finally think about it and think about why I behave that way. And then what I do is I try to take an overview of how these influences happen. So again, at the individual level, so how is it that I might reconstrue the situation in a way that makes me feel okay? I get people to understand that we predict that we're going to behave more in line with our values than we actually are. So we're really poor predictors of how we're going to behave. And you may remember, Lou, from the presentation in Mexico, there's really a great case study about women being asked sexually harassing questions in an interview. And a majority, when people are predicting how they'll behave, a majority of people say, oh, I'd stand up and I'd get up. And then it turns out in the interview that they actually were put people in an interview. That didn't happen. Same thing with charitable donations. We all think we're going to donate much more than we do. We think we're going to put in more effort into something we think we're going to go to the dentist more frequently. So we are a culture or a people of predicting that will behave better in some sense than we actually do. So I try to alert them to all of the pieces that might contribute at the individual level. Then I look at what happens when you become a member of a group. And so I put them in a situation where they're using a case study. They're all fishermen, and the fish that they are fishing are going extinct. So everybody is supposed to lower their intake. And then they go back and determine, it's a case called Shark that we wrote at Northwestern. And it turns out a lot of people overfish and the fish goes extinct. I use that to talk about what happens when there's other people in our group and we can't trust the behaviors that they're going to do,
Right.
that due to our own behavior. And then I look at organizations and we look at case studies from the Challenger all the way back to more recently, Wells Fargo. You can say, for example, you look at Wells Fargo and look at the reward systems and the great initiative they had and how that could lead even to the most ethical people responding to them.
Right.
Ways that aren't desirable.
Yeah, there's so many challenges that we don't think of, and just very recently, our students have signed a campus compact, and they're, I'm fully aware that many did travel to see family or to get away for a few days, regardless over the Easter weekend. But I it was a struggle because I'm working a lot with the off-campus students during this COVID year, and I had to make a decision not to go on spring break with my wife and children that were younger, and it seemed like it was a right decision to be consistent. But then I was torn with the question about whether or not for this past weekend I could go see my 83-year-old mother back in Buffalo, who I haven't seen in over a year now that we both have the vaccinations. And I don't know if what's the right ethical decision there. So the way I try to kind of answer that is I try to talk to a couple of people that I really respect here at the university and to get their insight, to get their take, because I don't fully trust my own ability to make that discernment. What suggestions do you give for people as they're trying to manage through an ethical decision?
Well, that's certainly one of them, right? Is to don't ask the people whose values you don't respect or perhaps are at best as good as yours, right? Ask the people who you really respect, what would you do? We often don't because of what's called the confirmation bias, right? I want confirming evidence to support what I want to do.
Right.
But what you can do, and so I always kind of use the very old advice, which is, could you say to your mom, hey, guess what? I did this. And what would they say? But to me, a lot of this is really understanding the these forces that I was talking about, and then using them in a way that allows you to behave better. So, for example, if I know that as I mentioned, I'm not going to behave as I think that I am, and let's take a situation. I think it's hard for us to relate to like big fraud because I would say most people, if or if not all, have not done that.
Mhm.
But let's say you say, if somebody says that in a meeting again, I'm going to say something. It's exclusionary, it's inappropriate, it dampens the voices of others. Let's just take a pretty typical example. You will predict that you will speak up more than you will. So the very first thing I say to students is you have to realize that you're probably not in the moment,
Mhm.
for a variety of reasons that we go through in the class. In the moment, you are probably not. So, number one, just be aware that you probably won't, right? Not necessarily, Lou, for these well planned out decisions like you did, right? You had some time, you thought about it.
Right.
So, it's be prepared that what we call your want self might triumph over your should self.
Yeah.
Then you should make sure that your should self is ready to kind of combat that want self. So, we know, for example, when you're tired, when you're over kind of stressed, that you will behave more unethically. That is fairly consistent evidence for that. Um, you have to be ready for how you will challenge someone or challenge a behavior. For example, right, there's a great program called Giving Voice to Values by Mary Gentile. And she says that if you look at people that have behaved heroically in their life, and she looks at rescuers, for example, in World War II, that they had a script. So they had a practice almost through their whole life of anticipating how they would behave and coming up with a script so that you weren't relying on yourself in that moment, because yourself is very tempted to want to get along with others. You don't want to rock the boat in a meeting. You don't want to be that person. And so coming up with a script in advance can help you live uh, in accordance with your values and in the way you predicted that you would, but without doing some of those. And those are just two of the very many pieces of advice that we give.
That's great. How about ethical blind spots? I know that's something that you teach about and you explore through your research. Um, I'm assuming that we all have ethical blind spots, but how do you identify them and how do you overcome them?
So again, we kind of start at that individual level. So, where are you? What's going on in your mind? One of the things, in addition to these prediction errors that I talked about, um, big component of a blind spot is ethical fading. So turns out that one of the ways you and I, Lou, and everyone else makes decisions is our mind first says, without maybe our awareness, what type of decision is this? And if it's a finance decision, you're going to drop all the relevant finance criteria and weight the decision on that. If your mind says, you know what, this is a legal decision, it's going to drop the relevant legal criteria, and you're going to make a decision based on those specific criteria. And of course, our mind, our brain does this because it couldn't use every criteria for every decision, right? It'd be like millions of criteria, and we'd never be able to make a decision. We'd be in, analysis paralysis. And so it does the shortcut. And what you worry about is when that frame, that decision criteria, if it doesn't include ethical criteria, I don't care how many ethics you have, Lou. I don't care how many principles you have. If it hasn't been coded as a decision with which those are relevant, then it's not going to have an impact. And the example I gave, as I mentioned, the Challenger, when the engineers had expressed concern for not the first time about launching, somebody on the management side, this was in Morton Thiokol, and obviously NASA wanted to launch. There was a lot of pressure to launch. NASA management layer turned to the engineers and said, take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. And you can certainly imagine the different criteria that might come up with management versus engineering versus put on your safety hat. And so reframing the decision is just one of the blind spots. Certainly, again, the reward systems that an organization uses can create a lot of blind spots. As I mentioned, Wells Fargo, we did a survey on Wall Street, Jordan Thomas and I, and found that more than a third thought their bonus and financial incentives created a situation that leads to unethical behavior. And in some sense, I'm less worried about them than I am about the 70% for which that reward system might have the same influence, but the people may not be aware that it's drive them. Heavy punishment, that was one of my first pieces of research, a heavy punishment kind of culture can lead to ethical fading. All I'm doing is calculating kind of what's the probability I'm going to get caught, what's the likelihood I'll get caught, and the question of what I should do doesn't really enter the picture. And then I would say hidden sources of blind spots in an organization are the informal aspects of the culture. So formal aspects would be, do we have an ombudsman? Do we have a code of conduct? Do we have a policy, right? So those are all the things that we can visibly point to. Turns out, though, it's the informal rewards from your peers, right? The informal rewards from your super, like getting asked to lunch, getting asked to a social event, getting asked to a baseball game, informal punishment, exclusion, right? Based on the way that if you're not behaving as the group would behave, right? So those are all things you can't really document. They're not on any form of piece of paper or anything. Turns out that informal systems are 9 times more influential than formal systems in predicting unethical behavior. That was research that we found. And so those are hidden sources. And I think of them not as blind spots in the same way as, ethical illusions and ethical fading, but they might be blind spots for leaders of organizations because they're looking at the formal systems.
Right.
And what's really driving the behavior is what exists in some sense at the level underneath that.
How about diagnostic testing through the interview process as you're trying to bring people into? Are there good vehicles to kind of test for ethical decision making before you bring somebody onto your team?
It's a question I get asked a lot. I don't know of any that I have seen through robust research that has produced a way, but here's why I would not go down that avenue. At least I would not as a researcher. The situation has such a tremendous impact on people. So again, the culture of the organization, the temptations in the moment, how tired you are, that when I randomly assign people to say 2 different conditions, and I present one with a temptation and one not, randomly assigned means there shouldn't be really any differences between the people because you were random. I didn't pick you on this characteristic, right? I can get you to behave, or a majority of you to behave unethically. It has not been that hard, and I don't really even offer many incentives to do so.
Mhm.
So, given that, what I would be worried about, I'm not saying don't do it, but then don't have the false belief that everybody that made it, so maybe you weeded out people that aren't good. Don't be sitting there with this false illusion that
Right.
you're now okay. So, what I worry about the most is complacency
Got it.
um, of organizations.
Yeah. That could lead you, if you think, oh, we've got this ethical screen, I don't have to concern ourselves about ethics in the workplace would be a scary conclusion to make. Um,
Exactly.
Let me ask you a little bit about teaching undergraduates in the Mendoza College of Business and students beyond. Undergraduates are clearly going to have less work experience than when you're teaching MBA students who typically have 5, 6 years of work experience before coming back. Does that make your teaching business ethics differently at the undergraduate level than it does at the graduate level?
So first of all, because of what I taught and what some of the demands were, didn't teach undergrads for a very long time. So I was very excited to actually go teach undergraduates in addition to my executive MBAs. This is kind of the sad news is we've been exposed to ethical dilemmas all our lives. So they might not have them in a big workforce or
Yeah.
as a supervisor, but to say that you're not faced with ethical dilemmas from the time, I mean, people study moral development of infants. And so um, they are they connect with the material quite well. It's certainly a different depth for undergrads, say, than it is for my executive MBAs. So I might do a debate on should the university be allowed to use your social media, and there's been several cases of that, to somehow reprimand you in the university. And I talk to them. I really want to bring that up because as they go out in the workforce, right, what you do in your personal life is no longer that separate from what you do in your organization, where you see a lot of the blurring of the lines there. Or if you're on a student committee, is it okay to just recruit your friends?
Mhm.
So what do we know about biases in terms of what type of people we prefer? How does that lead to exclusion? How does that lead to discrimination? But that's a case study that's very much in their bandwidth. For my executives, we might talk about should there be legislation to mandate gender representation on boards.
Mhm.
Uh, should a leader be held more like a CEO? Should they be held more responsible for unethical behavior in their organization than their employees?
Mhm.
Should board of directors be fined? So we do. One that each year I usually update cases based on. So I'll keep some the same because they're classic and they've stood the test of time, and then I'll introduce new ones. And one that we did this year, for example, in the executive class, was on employee activism,
Mhm.
and should organizations ethically respond in some sense to employees that want, let's say, an organization to boycott a product or boycott a person, or I can imagine, cases on the cancel culture, which has
Yeah.
certainly become relevant. So, um, so the depth and the application is different. The fundamentals are the same, and the reason for that is we don't need organizational experience to know that we haven't behaved ethically.
Yeah. These are all uh, fairly complex areas that are gray in many ways, and trying to think about if you're a manager of a team and to what extent do you intervene in employee activism or or cancel culture like on college campuses and so forth. My guess is that as a teacher, you're more of a facilitator and helping people to think in a deep and very thoughtful way about the answers rather than giving them right answers. Would that be fair?
Yeah, exactly. So again, a lot of this is exploration. So when have you deviated from your values? So I don't want it to be some abstract, Joe Schmo behaved unethically. That's really interesting. And we certainly look at people that have, and
Yeah.
people that will say they were altar boys and they grew up in the Catholic Church and then they ended up in jail, right? So why would somebody with let's say an upbringing similar to yours end up this way? So some of it is identifying, but it's really internal. And then I have them do audits. So the undergrads might do an audit of the Mendoza culture. It might do an audit of their dorm. It might do an audit of SIBC. The
Mhm.
executives do it of their organizations, to identify within, again, their own lives, what are some pressure points that they were no longer, that they were not aware of. And that in some sense, maybe they no longer accept. So it was not my goal, but I have had a few students in the executive program change jobs once they went through the audit.
Interesting. That's fascinating. Well, we had, I was relatively new to the Notre Dame team when we hired George O'Leary as the head football coach, who was here for all of 5 days. And it became very clear that he had misrepresented some things on his resume that, quite frankly, had been on his resume for 25, 30 years and had not come to the light of day, that they were misrepresentations. And I remember reading afterwards that there were some uh, researchers had estimated that some 20 to 30 percent of all resumes in the country were changed because of that. That many people have misrepresented things. Is that something that I imagine there's embellishments like that all the time when people are trying to enter the marketplace in the competition for jobs.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is identify one of the factors that people have studied, which is competition, right? So the more competition there is, the more I'm going to behave unethically. So the answer to that, you've in some sense already qualified, which is in those jobs which are really competitive, you would be more likely to see that behavior. There's always this false notion, I think, that I'm just going to do it to get in. And
Yeah.
then it's okay. Then that's all I need, right? I just need my foot in the door. But as you mentioned, the example of O'Leary, right? What happens is we kind of begin a slippery slope.
Hmm.
And that is that once we deviate from our values, and I would argue, even in such a way that is so indiscernible, you may not even code it as a deviation. It
Hmm.
then leads, now that behavior, so keeping it on your resume, right? He didn't need to have that probably on his resume, right? But that almost becomes okay now because I did it a long time ago. And then there might be another embellishment, and then there might be another embellishment. So my caution, and yes, it's very tempting um, when it's competition. I am more likely to behave unethically when I'm in this domain of losses. This goes back to Kahneman's work. So when I have to pay back debts, when I see myself as not having as many offers as other people. So all of those, and forget the competitive part of that. When I'm seeing losses looming large, I'm also likely, and that could be a case for a lot of people, students, right? After debt, right? They don't have any job. Um, but my caution always is, and this is what I tell a lot of corporations that I've worked with, is pay attention to the small behaviors, right?
Hmm.
Don't tell yourself you just need to get it to get the job, because now, right, your that behavior was okay. You rationalize it in your mind, both before, during, and after the fact. And so I always say to organizations, I mean, don't wait for the big $1 billion scandal. It's too late.
Yeah.
That look for small, like this one woman that we talk about in class. She noticed that her organization accidentally, she had charged her vacation to her company credit card and realized no one caught her. And that just led to a series of bad behaviors by her. And she ended up in jail and giving her 2-year-old to her parents as she walked into jail. So, right, pay attention. Like, I know expense reports are something we all talk about, but honestly, if you have repeated behavior in these small areas, including, employees that maybe people say, he doesn't treat people right,
Right.
whether
Right.
that's all people, whether that's women, whether that's minorities, you should be paying attention and don't dismiss it, because to be honest, it's more likely to grow. And once you dismiss it, it almost facilitates it, both internally, cognitively, and everyone else around you exhibits what we also study, which is called motivated blindness. And
Hmm.
that is, I ignore the bad behavior of others when it's not in my best interest to do so. So if I know that you're not going to do anything about this person, then I'm going to be motivatedly blind because it's not in my best interest to bring it up if nothing's going to happen, right? I'm just going to end up in hot water with them.
Probably too soon to research, but do you believe instinctively that the pandemic will exacerbate moral, ethical behavior, and that it has put more stress on people and on companies pretty much across the board?
So I do worry about the stress aspect. So certainly that's one of them. There's a couple of other pieces that I've talked to some compliance officers about. One is, again, in this domain of losses, I am so focused on trying to make us whole.
Mhm.
And ethics is kind of taking a back seat, right? Like, let's just get whole and then we can worry. It's often, and can be frustrating for people in that role, seen as kind of extra. It's something we do when life is good, is pay attention to our ethics. That's not true of all companies, certainly not true of all people, but it is a fear. Another piece, and I in a research group that I'm in, we've talked about this for a long time. Unfortunately, it's very hard to get data on this, but we've often wondered about remote workers and how do you get them to accept the culture, right? Culture is so much experienced and felt
Right.
and interacted with you. So, right, I see you, Lou, do something ethical that maybe was uncomfortable. And I say, oh, that's what we do here. People
Hmm.
often ask me, and I'm sure they do, and anybody that has been at Notre Dame, why is it so special? You can't really, you come up with all the cliches, but it's something you feel, right? And I can't tell you, but I know it kind of when I see it. So that's that informal culture I was talking about. That is very hard to transmit electronically. Now, and this is what we've talked about in this group, is if you have a bad culture, having people isolated might be better because they're
Right.
not
Right.
taking that in, right? So if you're in an industry or an organization, maybe they should push their workers out.
Yeah.
If you're in a good culture, that transmission of the norms through stories of our heroes and actions that people have taken. I mean, we can all cite the stories of Notre Dame. We're like, oh, that's Notre Dame.
Yeah.
It's going to be much harder for you to get them and to feel them. So I worry about the stress. I worry about the losses and the focus on making us financially whole,
Hmm.
expense. And I definitely, but this has been ongoing much more so now, is how will remote working change transmission of culture?
I'm a little afraid to ask this next question, but has your research that you've conducted or have read from others, uh, does it show any distinction between religious inspired organizations that already have an ethical framework from the behavior of secular organizations, or is it pretty much consistent across the board?
Well, there hasn't, so it's often hard for people that study at the firm level to get data on this. So that's one of I can get data on how you think.
Yeah.
Organizations aren't very open to you examining their ethics.
Mhm.
So I would say the data is sparse. So with that as a qualifier, religiosity, at least in individuals, has sometimes shown to be an impact. So religious people can behave more ethically. It's not, again, a dominant force is the situation, even with people that are religious. But gender actually is one of the most robust. So I'm not saying this because you're there, but women tend to be more ethical in general. So like when I run studies, I have to control for gender to make sure that I don't have more females in one situation than in the other, which could be driving the results, for example. Um, there's another individual difference called moral identity, which is how important is it for you to be ethical and not surprising. That is a personality variable or a demographic, if you will, that leads to more ethical behavior. So, but in general, the influence, oh, this is interesting. So this may be related to being Catholic. Guilt proneness, which is a personality. Not do you feel guilt? You might feel guilt about a situation, but you may overall not be very high in guilt proneness. But for those that are high in guilt proneness, this is real. This is research from my former postdoc that I want to explore. She and her co-author found that it leads you to avoid situations in which your ethics may be tempted
Hmm.
because you're so worried about probably feeling guilty that you stay
Yeah.
away from them.
Yeah.
So you could explore that with religions that maybe have a higher guilt proneness population.
Yeah,
People that don't. But again, the situation is just so dominant and
yeah,
explaining the results that we get, that these individual differences play a part,
yeah.
not going to compensate for the situation.
Yeah, the Lord's Prayer, "Lead us not into temptation," is something that you do. The older you get, you think about more and more. Let me ask you, and this may be too difficult a question, but whether it's current or if it's a moment in time, is there a particular organization or business that you like to highlight in terms of it having engendered a really ethical, positive ethical culture that stands out?
So I don't.
Mhm.
And I'll just give you an example. So Johnson and Johnson, we put in there in our book as a great organization. You can go all the way back to the Tylenol crisis and others. Right before we were going to press, they were involved in a scandal. And the publisher said, "Do you want to remove this? Because
Mhm.
this just happened." And we said no, because there's never going to be an organization that you can guarantee is going to be. They had still done a lot of things that were excellent. And to me, that's the better way to approach it, is how do organizations learn from their, you are going to have mistakes. Individually, you're going to have mistakes at the group level, at the division level, and in the organization. It's not hiding those, but it's bringing them to light, admitting that you made a mistake and correcting them. To me, those are the types of organizations that I would highlight, and there are many of them. Not one that has remained scandal free, because I don't think you can't say in the next 5 years this company for sure. So if I named one right now,
Yeah.
I'd probably
For
be
periods
called.
of time, you might have a really good culture, but that culture is not to be taken for granted. And in any organization or time, it certainly could evolve for either the better or to make missteps and evolve for the worst. One, two final questions. First, you recently have taken on the role, in addition to everything else, as senior assistant provost for internationalization. Can you tell us how, through your work, and why has the internationalization of Notre Dame um, risen to the surface for you as such an important theme?
Sure. I think I've actually been there 7 years now. So started almost when it began with Nick, and now with Michael Pippinger, who's doing a phenomenal job. Um, why I really became interested, and I'm sure other people have this experience, is I am fortunate to do conferences and research with international collaborators. And when I go to these conferences, people say, "Notre Dame? Where's that? Is that a good school?" I'm like, "Are you serious?" Like, had zero knowledge. And these are people in the academic world. So I wanted the good story of Notre Dame to be accessible to everyone, not just within this country. And I identified it, and as did many others. That's why I think, very rightfully placing importance on it, is Notre Dame has should have, it does, but we should have a bigger international reach. We should have a bigger international reputation. We have great faculty, we have great students, we have a great contribution to make to the world, and we're limiting ourselves. So that is something I feel incredibly strongly about, is spreading Notre Dame's contributions across the world.
Any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience about their own kind of individual? I mean, you've given a lot already. Ethical decision making. Any guides? Any pearls of wisdom?
The first thing, again, that I would say is it's okay to reflect on your failures.
Mhm.
It the very first thing you should do is just take a stock, maybe every week, maybe in your prayers, to say, when didn't I behave? And then think about, okay, here's a situation. And again, identify what seems to consistently be your temptations, the situation that you seem to fall down on.
Yeah.
And then prepare for them and say, okay, this is how I should have done this. And like you said, don't just ask people that you respect, model what they do, right? When you see somebody who stands up in a meeting and says, right, "I don't think so," or something else, stands up against a practice that they believe to be wrong, What did they do? How did they say it? Right? Surround yourself. And the final piece of advice, I have like a million because this is my class,
Right.
is surround yourself. You will be the people you become. So when you go into an organization, you will become like most of the people there. Who
Yeah.
you hang out with and their behaviors will be very similar to the behaviors you adopt. So be very careful to pay attention to the groups and the organizations that you find yourself involved in.
No, those are great words of wisdom. Ann, I cannot thank you enough for your research, which is contributing to, I think, better behavior and deeper understanding across the board in terms of ethical decision making throughout the nation and world, for that matter, and not just limited to business, but all organizations and individual and family behavior as well. But thank you also for what you transmit to our students, both the graduate students as well as the undergraduate students, the huge and important difference that you're making. We are really grateful. If people want to reach out to you, I know that you do a lot of consulting and you work with a lot of boards and businesses and other organizations. I'm sure people could just reach out to you. I imagine if they want you to weigh in on something or give a presentation, they can just reach you via your email here on campus. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Thanks again for being with us today. I want to let you know that next week, Wednesday, we're going to be joined by a Notre Dame senior student. Her name is Emily Eagle, and I promise you, she will be worth the price of admission. You're not going to want to miss the discussion with her. She's an absolutely wonderful young woman who I promise will inspire you in powerful ways. Um, if you are interested, join us tomorrow as well at 2:30. We're going to do our third episode of Fighting Irish Foodies. We're going to be joined by Riley Vissers, who is the chef de cuisine of University Catering, and he is going to be making a spring risotto, and it'll be a live 90-minute cooking class. Will be coming from Foley's here on the south end of the stadium. If you want to cook with us, register online at giving.nd.edu, and you can cook along. They'll give you the list of ingredients to purchase, and you can cook along with us, or just tune in to participate in that event. So, as we always do, thank you for joining us, taking time out of your busy schedules, and we'll close with a prayer to Our Lady. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Take care. God bless, and go Irish. Thank you. Thanks, Ann.